The first gentle light of dawn painted the rooftops in soft hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Maplewood Estates. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the aroma of brewing coffee, wafting from open kitchen windows. It was a neighborhood that wore its regulations like a snug, tailored suit, every blade of grass in place, every hedge trimmed with geometric precision. And then there was Karen. Karen was the embodiment of the Homeowners Association's stringent rules, a sentinel of suburban order, her eyes sharp as hawks as they patrolled the cul-de-sac. She was the kind of woman who could spot an unsanctioned garden gnome from half a block away and would note its presence with the same gravity others might reserve for an actual crime scene. It started small, almost innocuous. A polite note slipped under my door, its edges crisp, the script annoyingly precise. A comment on the volume of laughter emanating from my backyard during an evening barbecue. She suggested, in that passive-aggressive tone only she could truly master, that Maplewood Estates was a place of tranquility and respect. I chuckled, imagining the sound waves of laughter as rebellious spirits daring to disturb the carefully cultivated quiet. It was a barbecue, not a rock concert, but I let it slide, resolving to be more mindful. After all, she was just doing her duty as she saw it. A few weeks passed, the note forgotten like leaves carried away by a gentle breeze. Then came the second incident, more pointed, like the cutting edge of a knife dulled by disuse but still effective. Another note, this time more formal, bearing the HOA's seal. A noise complaint filed officially. It detailed the supposed disturbance from the installation of a new sound system in my living room. I could almost hear her satisfaction in every word, her victory smile as she dropped the complaint into the mailbox. I sighed, placing the paper on the kitchen counter where it lay among the clutter of daily life. An annoyance, yes, but hardly worth the effort of rebuttal. I had lived here for years, long enough to understand that in a battle of wills, Karen was a worthy adversary, entrenched in her self-appointed role as guardian. Yet, there was an irony to it all. The very system she wielded with such precision was also bound by rules, rules I had learned to navigate with quiet efficiency. If Karen was the face of the HOA, I was its unseen hand, adept at turning its mechanisms to my favor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, I began to consider the possibilities. Karen had taken the first move in a game she didn't realize she was playing. My mind turned over the pieces, contemplating the board. Patience was key, and I was in no hurry. In the quiet of my living room, the world outside settling into its nightly rhythm, I allowed myself a small, knowing smile. There was a path through this maze of bylaws and regulations, a way to show Karen the extent of her overreach. But that would come later. For now, I'd savor the anticipation, each step of the plan unfolding with the precision of a well-crafted symphony. The morning air was thick with the promise of another relentless suburban summer. The sun, a relentless overseer, had already begun its slow crawl across the cloudless sky, casting long shadows on the neat rows of identical houses. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee that was still too hot, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. It was a ritual of sorts, a moment of calm before the day unfolded with its usual predictability. But predictability was not a luxury afforded to those under the reign of Karen. Karen, with her clipboard, her ever-watchful eyes, her whispers that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, scorching reputations and fueling resentments that had been simmering for years. She was a force of nature, though not the nurturing kind. The noise complaint had been only the beginning, a single strike in what would become a campaign marked by absurdity and pettiness. Karen, it seemed, had grown bolder, her sights set on maintaining a draconian order, one citation at a time. New rules sprouted like weeds in the community garden, a garden that, coincidentally, had been the subject of her latest tirade due to its unseemly wildflowers. I felt the weight of her stare even when I couldn't see her. It was the pressure of someone always waiting for you to slip, to falter, to give her reason to wield her authority with righteous indignation. She had taken to patrolling the neighborhood at odd hours, her silhouette framed by the glow of street lamps, a specter in sensible shoes. The first citation came as I was pruning the hedges, a task I found soothing in its monotony. The letter, folded with precise corners, accused me of an unsanctioned paint color on the mailbox, a beige indistinguishable from the sanctioned shade, but to Karen's discerning eye, an affront to community standards. I wondered if she had memorized the color swatch book. Then came the allegations of trash bins left out too long, a claim that would have been laughable if not for the accompanying fine. I paid it, grudgingly, the transaction fueling my quiet resolve. Each new decree was a battle in her one-woman war, and each battle left casualties in its wake. The peace of mind, the camaraderie that once existed, now fractured by her divisive tactics. Gossip flowed through the neighborhood like an underground river, carrying tales of Karen's latest exploits. She was seen pacing the perimeter of the community pool, measuring distances between deck chairs and frowning at imagined infractions. Mothers whispered at playgrounds, eyes darting nervously, lest their children's laughter attract her disapproving gaze. Yet, even as she tightened her grip, I sensed an undercurrent of change. A subtle shift, like the moment before a storm when the air grows still and charged. My neighbors, once resigned to her rule, had begun to exchange glances, conspiratorial and knowing. The stories they shared over fences now carried a different weight, a collective realization that perhaps the time had come to push back. The irony was not lost on me. Her insistence on control, her need to mold the neighborhood to her vision, might very well be her undoing. I saw it in the eyes of those around me, a quiet rebellion brewing, patience stretched to its limit. We were bound by her rules, yes, but not broken by them. A plan had begun to form, unspoken, yet understood. If she could use the HOA's framework to tighten her hold, then perhaps that same structure might serve to loosen it. I finished my coffee, the last sip bitter and cold, but satisfying in its promise of action. I watched the sun rise higher, burning away the morning mist, and thought of the certainty of change. The neighborhood was quiet again, a tranquil facade draped over the recent discord. The day after the meeting, I sat in my study, the gentle hum of my computer a soft whisper in the room. Karen's complaint, the noise, the disruption, breathed life into something unexpected. Her insistence on control was palpable, like a heavy fog refusing to lift. But beneath that fog, clarity awaited. I spent hours sifting through documents, the HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, and anything that bore Karen's fingerprints. Each page was a window into her reign, her self-appointed monarchy. There it was, in stark black and white, the trail of her complaints, each more trivial than the last. The pattern emerged like a shadow slipping out of the darkness. She wielded the HOA like a cudgel, bruising anyone who dared disturb her version of peace. My fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the desk, a silent conversation with my thoughts. I had never been one for conflict, but this was no longer about me. It was about us, all the neighbors she had wronged. The quiet ones, the ones who smiled politely, then retreated into their homes, their sanctuaries invaded. I compiled a dossier, a curated collection of her indiscretions. The irony was not lost on me. Her meticulous record-keeping, designed to maintain order, was now the cornerstone of her undoing. I prepared my countermove, not with malice, but with the precision of a chess player anticipating the checkmate several moves ahead. Days melted into one another, each passing with the slow inevitability of a pendulum's swing. I attended the next HOA meeting with the calm demeanor of a seasoned performer waiting for their cue. The room was, as I remembered, sterile and orderly, the air tinged with the faint smell of coffee and anticipation. Karen sat at the head of the table, her demeanor imperious, the crown of her imagined kingdom. As the meeting unfolded, I bided my time, listening to the mundane matters with a detached interest. Then, the moment arrived, a lull pregnant with opportunity. I spoke deliberately, my words measured and precise. I laid out the evidence not as an attack, but as a series of observations. The room shifted, the air electric with realization. It was as if the entire community leaned in, a collective gasp held in their throats. Karen's facade cracked, her polished veneer splintering under the weight of truth. Her response was a predictable mix of indignation and denial, but the room had already turned. The power she clung to slipped away, grains of sand through her fingers. The finality was not in her words, but in the eyes of those around her, neighbors who saw her for the first time, not as a leader, but as a bully. The vote was swift, a silent rebellion against the tyranny of one. Her privileges, her authority, revoked with a quiet dignity. I left the meeting with an unexpected lightness, the weight of her shadow no longer looming over our community. As I walked home, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows on the pavement, shadows that, like Karen's influence, were destined to fade with the coming dawn. The morning sun slipped through the blinds, painting stripes of light and shadow across the living room floor. The neighborhood was waking, but an eerie silence blanketed the street, a kind of silence that hinted at the storm beneath the surface, the storm that had started with Karen's noise complaint. A pebble tossed into the pond, sending ripples through the otherwise calm waters of our community. Karen had been the self-appointed gatekeeper of the HOA's sanctity, her voice a constant hum in the background, like a distant, unyielding siren. Her complaints were a fact of life, much like the weather, sometimes predictable, often irritating, but always there. Her latest crusade against noise, a symphony of trivial grievances, had been her undoing. A noise complaint crafted with surgical precision aimed at me, but it had boomeranged in the most unexpected way. Neighbors were beginning to take notice. Conversations halted mid-sentence when her name floated in the air. Glances exchanged that carried the weight of unspoken realizations. It was as if the veil had been lifted and the strings she had meticulously pulled were laid bare for all to see. Her influence, once absolute, was now unraveling thread by thread. Tension simmered, palpable as the heat rising from the asphalt. It spread through the community like a slow-moving contagion, infecting the very foundations of neighborly trust. Front lawns became demilitarized zones where greetings were exchanged with cautious neutrality. The vibrant tapestry of our neighborhood had faded to gray. The vibrant hues of camaraderie now muted whispers in the wind. Karen's once commanding presence at HOA meetings had diminished to a shadow. Her voice, once a clarion call to order, now cracked under the weight of her faltering authority. She had become the embodiment of irony, the queen dethroned by her own decree. The rules she wielded with such fervor had become shackles, binding her tighter with each passing day. I watched the spectacle unfold with a quiet satisfaction, a chess player watching the board as pieces moved into place. Patience had been my ally, and irony my weapon. The symphony of her complaints had reached a crescendo, and the irony was too sweet to ignore. Her noise complaint had been the catalyst, but it was her hubris that had set the stage for her downfall. The street was a stage, and we were all players, caught in a drama of our own making. Behind closed doors, whispers of rebellion grew louder, the seeds of dissent taking root. Karen's reign had been long and undisputed, but now, as her power waned, the neighborhood braced itself for the inevitable change. Irony hung in the air, a silent witness to the unraveling of her carefully woven tapestry of control. The pendulum had swung, and there was no stopping its momentum. The neighborhood was waking, and with it, the winds of change began to stir. As the day unfolded, I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air of newfound freedom. The storm had passed, and a new dawn was breaking. The morning sun filtered through my kitchen blinds, casting stripes of light across the checkered tile floor. It was a Monday, the day most people dreaded. But not me. Today was especially satisfying. As I sipped my coffee, the aroma wrapping around me like a comforting embrace, I felt an unusual calmness settle within. Last night had been quiet. Unnaturally so, but it was the kind of silence that accompanies resolve. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association, had made herself scarce after our last encounter. Her pointed accusations and those incessant noise complaints had finally reached a crescendo, but not in the way she had expected. I had taken care to document everything, every baseless complaint, every thinly veiled threat. I had preserved her vitriol in emails, her condescension in board meeting minutes, but it wasn't the documentation that empowered me. It was the knowledge that the law, with its quietly humming machinery, was on my side. After weeks of research, I had unearthed a rather obscure provision in our HOA's bylaws, a provision that, ironically, Karen herself had passed over in her zeal. It stated that any board member found guilty of frivolous complaints or harassment could be removed from their position. I had the evidence, neatly compiled and unassailable. The legal process unfurled with the elegance of a well-orchestrated ballet. A soft knock at my door one afternoon brought a courier with legal papers, precise and heavy with consequence. As I signed, I could feel the anticipation building, like the crest of a wave poised to break. Karen received her notice the following Friday. The board meeting was an exercise in irony. She, usually a whirlwind of authority, sat subdued. Her bravado evaporated. Her eyes scanned the room, seeking allies, but meeting only indifference. Those she had once bullied now found her powerless, her reign of pettiness dismantled by the very rules she wielded. I watched her from across the room, her fingers tapping an anxious staccato on the conference table. And in that moment, I understood the complexity of silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something much deeper. A reckoning. The board members filed out one by one, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. I lingered at the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. It was not triumph I felt, nor vengeance, just a quiet, assured satisfaction. Justice had a rhythm of its own, a slow and steady beat that, once started, was impossible to stop. As I left, the evening air was cool against my skin, carrying with it the sweet scent of lavender from the garden. The world seemed unchanged, yet profoundly different. Balance restored. I walked past Karen's house, the lights inside low and warm, like the fading embers of a once roaring fire. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt as it should, a place of peace and quiet. And perhaps there was a lesson in all this. That power, when misused, eventually collapses under its own weight. That justice, though sometimes delayed, is all the more satisfying when earned. I took a deep breath, exhaling the past week's tension into the cooling night. And as the stars began their evening dance across the sky, I knew that in the end, silence truly was golden. The day began like any other, but somewhere beneath the surface, anticipation hummed like the gentle buzz of a bumblebee. The sun spilled through my kitchen window, slicing across the floor like golden ribbons, and I could almost hear the universe shifting. Karen's reign, one of oppressive rules and overzealous regulation, was about to meet its quiet end. It started with her filing that noise complaint, her usual tactic to maintain a semblance of control. But she'd never imagined it would be the thread that, when tugged, unraveled her carefully woven web of power. The neighborhood gathered for the meeting, a congregation of the curious and the restless. The air buzzed, thick with unspoken words and shared glances. I watched them file in, each face a tapestry of muted hope and hidden smiles. Each had a story, a grievance tucked quietly into the halls of memory, waiting for this moment. As I entered the community hall, the wooden floor creaked with the weight of anticipation. I moved to my seat with measured steps, the noise complaint documents neatly tucked under my arm. Around me, whispered conversations ebbed and flowed, a tide of speculation. Karen arrived fashionably late, the click of her heels a metronome of authority she'd wielded for too long. Her smile was sharp, her gaze sweeping the room with the confidence of someone who believed themselves untouchable. But today, the stage was mine. There was no fanfare as the meeting commenced, just a collective inhale as our community leader called for attention. I felt the weight of eyes upon me, expectations hovering like storm clouds. I stood, the words I'd rehearsed 1,000 times lining up like soldiers ready to march. In the dimly lit room, my voice cut through the silence, steady and sure. I laid out the details, the noise complaint, the subsequent investigation, the discoveries that painted Karen not as the enforcer of peace, but as its disturber. The irony was stark, the layers of hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. Karen shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing into slits of disbelief as the room absorbed my words. The symphony of collective realization played out in a series of gasps and murmurs, the noise complaint her own undoing. High irony indeed. The community leader listened, nodding with a gravitas that signaled the weight of the situation. And then, in a moment that seemed almost surreal, the motion was passed. Karen's privileges were revoked, the layers of her influence peeled away like an old coat. The vote was unanimous. Poetic justice, delivered by those she'd sought to control. I watched as Karen sat, shock frozen on her face, an expression of disbelief that slowly morphed into reluctant acceptance. Her fingers, once so deft at weaving rules and whispers, now fidgeted aimlessly. The room held its breath, caught in the spell of unexpected quiet. As the meeting concluded, the community dispersed in a flurry of quiet conversations and newfound camaraderie. There was a sense of restoration in the air, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. I lingered for a moment, savoring the satisfaction that came with righting a wrong. Karen exited with the last of the crowd, her silhouette a study in defeat, but I knew she'd carry on. A different path, perhaps, one with less power and more humility. I left the hall with a lightness in my step, the sun a warm embrace as it began its descent. The neighborhood felt different now, the quiet no longer a cloak of compliance, but a testament to collective resilience. There was a beauty to it, the way communities bounce back, like flowers pushing through cracks in the pavement. As I walked home, I allowed myself a smile, not a victory grin, but something softer, touched by the knowledge that sometimes justice doesn't need a roar, just a whisper and a timely tug at the right thread.